present Biden administration, the key player in terms of Asian policies, the so-called Asia czar, has been Kurt Campbell, who created this notion of pivot to Asia a long while ago, 10 years ago. Now, when he left the Obama administration, he went private. He created his own company called the Asia Group. And that group became very popular very fast because he had a marquee name. He had a very attractive, high-profile name. Now, Jake Sullivan did something similar. When Hillary Clinton's campaign failed, he left and joined a company called Macro Advisory Partners, in which the British intelligence chiefs have played a great role. Antony Blinken joined West Exec together with Michel Flournoy, who is a very powerful background factor in all of this. Now, these private companies, then West Exec created a joint venture or strategic partnership with Pine Island, which is about venture capital portfolio funds, whose members are now Blinken and Lloyd Austin until they became members of the Biden administration. Their biggest clients are the big defense. In other words, those defense contractors that are global by their operations and very large in terms of their market capitalization. Their clients also include the Taipei Economic and Cultural Office, which is a de facto or effective Taiwanese embassy, if you will, in the US. So these clients shape the agendas. Naturally, when these members joined the administration, they took distance from these organizations. Others strongly, others not so strongly. Nonetheless, there is this issue of potential moral hazard. There's this issue of alleged interest conflicts. US media has been very vocal about these issues and was so already in January, February. And I think that what we've seen, the aggressiveness of the geopolitics indicates that if the defense contractors certainly aren't driving national policies, but their interests are being taken into account. And that is very unfortunate in this situation. And I should also mention Lyle Barnard, who is the wife of Mr. Campbell and who is now in charge of the decisions of the Fed in terms of rate cuts and tightening. So there's few peoples that hold quite a lot of power in this regard. If I can have the next slide. So the real issue, and this is a very complicated one, and I would be curious to hear what my colleagues here think about it, is how do you cultivate national interest in basically an era that's when we are globally interdependent? In these particular cases, when we talk about think tanks or administrations or defense contractors, it's one thing, but they have then parallels that reflect, I believe, in ASEAN. One example is the Strat-based ADR Institute for Strategic and International Studies, whose studies have been very intriguing and very interesting. And but when you look at the ownership relationships and the role of the key players, those who sponsor this particular institute, and the power that they hold in terms of their holding company, in terms of their ultimate Indonesian owner, I believe, and then all kinds of other subsidiaries that go from Metro Pacific, PLDT to Philex Mining, and that have then arms going to Maynilad, Meralco, and so on and so forth, and that own certain kind of media. It gets more problematic. By this, I am certainly not saying that there is a direct causal relationship that the owner determines the policies, but it's harder for those media to go against sometimes their owners. We've seen in the so-called big world how that happens. If Washington Post or its editors, its writers, or New York Times want to have a scoop, they might be told that, look, if you do this, it will limit our access to decision makers. It's a very difficult balancing act. And what makes the situation even more complex is that when you look at the ADR, some of its key executives are also part of a private company, Strat-based, which has links with Bauer Group Asia, which had links with US ASEAN Business Council, which is linked with a whole lot of other organizations, and ADR itself with the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative, and CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, one of the most powerful US think tanks in this area. So the benign way of looking at this is to think that, well, these are great points of access. This way we can better understand what happens in the major economies, such as the United States, and thereby take into account their possible views in the region. The not so benign view is that this will limit strategic flexibility, and this will limit what people can do and say. If I can have the next slide, the second last one. I believe that if we have seen anything ever since the Greater Recession, 2008 and 9, it is that national interest matters. And if we take a long perspective to the Philippines, and this is the way I understand the comments of the new president, we should really feel distressed and apprehensive about the fact that in the post-war era, Philippines was seen as the most likely economy to succeed, to grow fast in Southeast Asia. And yet, over time, it has fallen behind the several peer countries. And I personally feel, and of course, this is possible debate, there were efforts to that direction before, but I personally feel that when you look at the purposeful national industrialization, that only began under President Duterte in 2016. Build, build, build. The idea was to create a physical infrastructure, interconnectedness, and thereby pave the way for human capital, which is something that I believe his daughter is after right now in the new administration. But this took such a long time. So the question is not so much can we, or should we rewrite the history? We always rewrite the history. The question is, what are we going to do now? How are we going to move towards the future? And if we renounce our national interest or think that it only pertains to 1 to 10% of the nation, that is a serious mistake. And I think that many pre-Duterte administrations did that. If I can have this last slide. So independent foreign policy matters. And it matters a lot. And it matters far more than ever before currently. If you look at the BRICS and their development, my dear acquaintance Jim O'Neill, when he created the term, noticed something that then has become sort of an axiom, and that is that those countries that are successful in their economic development have a zero conflict principle. At one point, Turkey had it. At another point, China had it. It is very, very difficult to sustain it. I think that what is needed in Philippines is an independent foreign policy that primarily and paramountly looks at the Philippine national interest. And it should also be closely coordinated with ASEAN, partly because there are so many affinities, so many parallels with ASEAN, and partly because through ASEAN you have a greater voice in international policies. About 10 years ago, I had the pleasure to be in Singapore as a visiting scholar. And one of the many people I had also a privilege to meet was Tommy Koh. He was a key player in the creation of the platform of the constitution of the ASEAN. And he told me how whenever he would go to Europe, the Europeans would kind of jokingly chide him for not being integrated enough. And Koh would say that, look, well, in ASEAN, we are very diverse and we don't want to have a kind of a straitjacket. We want to have independence and unity, sovereignty and cooperation. And honestly, when you look at back 10 years, you can make a case for Tommy Koh. What we've seen in Europe are great difficulties when you can't devaluate in certain countries and you should revalue it in other countries. So here we have a situation where President Marcos Jr. wants to continue the Philippine special relationship with the US, but also hopes to find ways to resolve the conflicts with China. He has declared his support for independent foreign policy of his predecessor, former President Duterte. This is what we feel is best in the national interest, he said. He rejects the idea of aligning with just one country, saying you have to be friends to everyone. You don't want to be enemies with anyone. However, if you look at the right-hand side of the picture, And this is the reason why I've wrote a piece for the World Financial Review. Some of the slides I've used here come from that. I happened to see this TV broadcast show by NBC News. Behind it was CNAS, the think tank that has been led by Michel Flournoy and where Blinken has played a role and so on and so forth. They prepared a scenario for US-China-Taiwan War 2027. And there you can see in the upper hand picture on the left, troops and countries are a bit like chips in a great chessboard. And there underneath, there is a red enemy, which seems to be China. I had to ask myself, where did this year come from? 2027. I haven't heard any Chinese leader make reference to the fact that they intend to start a war with Taiwan 2027, or any war for that matter. I personally believe that they would try to do anything that they can to avoid it. They want to build economy. It turns out that this came from a retired American admiral who said in a hearing in Congress that he believes there might be a war in 2027. This happened a year ago. And CNAS used this as a basis for this scenario. These kind of simulations are understandable, but they're frightening because they get us used to the idea of war. They get us adjusted to that idea so that when it happens, and if it ever happens, God forbid, we take it almost for granted. It was bound to happen, we say. Understand the implication. Look at the right-hand side slide, which is from the study by CNAS, the same think tank that I mentioned earlier, and I had the slide of those moral hazards. It has several areas in East and Southeast Asia that would be centers of conflict. Southern China, Eastern China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and also Philippines. You can't avoid it. And if we factor in the possibility of nuclearization, which has escalated for a year or two now because of the AUKUS alliance, it would be all the more prevalent. So I think that the fact that President Marcos Jr. now has dedicated himself for the independent foreign policy, which is the only way really to build that upper middle income economy he's after. And I think what would benefit the Filipinos the most. The only way to achieve this is through peace. Through peace, you create stability. Through stability, you create prosperity. Any conflict will undermine it. And then we might have a situation like in Ukraine. And that's to be avoided at any cost. Thank you.
Thanks for watching. For more global insights from Integrated Development Studies Institute, subscribe, like, and share.